Okay, so next up we have an amazing panel with Lake Research Partners, headed up by Celinda Lake, legend in research. And also with just, one of my Yodas in my life, Mark Trahant, the managing editor for Indian Country Today. And we want to call them up to the stage now, and we are going to get into the results of the focus groups. And I would really encourage you to kind of pay attention to a lot of the trends and synergies that we saw between what we found in the Nielsen online survey and the focus group. So if we could have Mark and Celinda come to the stage. Thank you.
Okay, we have some more fun in store. I'll let you start, Celinda Lake, with the research.
Thank you. And just start talking? Great. Well, it's so wonderful to be here, and I must say, I thought it was intimidating to follow, very intimidating to follow Crystal. Now I'm really intimidated to follow Charlene, so, but I have very exciting research, and it's really wonderful to be part of this team. And I want to give credit to our full team, including Kate Gormley and Alicia Snell, and full credit to the Illumination team. Crystal and others were very, very much intellectual forces behind this research. What I'm going to present to you is the research that we did among focus groups, which are small group discussions, and I'll show you where we recruited them in the composition. These were all done online so that we were able to recruit mixes of people and recruit across states. The states that were included were Arizona, California, Minnesota, New Mexico, Nevada, New York, and Wisconsin, because that's where Native communities are really concentrated. And we did one group of black women, we did a group of Gen Zers, we did a group of Asian Americans, we did a group of black men, we did white voters who live within 200 miles of casinos, we did Latinas and Latinos, we did white, non-college educated suburban women, and we did Gen Zers. So a and white men who were avid sports watchers. So really interesting combination of allies and tougher groups, and an interesting combination of the people that are impacted in different ways. All of these slides and the full report, by the way, are available through Illumination. Now, focus groups we don't quantify. For those of you who are unfamiliar with research, we'd never say like half of the people said X or Y or something like that. What we do is we take the questions that Charlene and Illuminative had revealed through the survey research, and in both ways of the survey research, and we look for the reasons behind the questions. The yes, but, the reason that you're feeling affinity or not, the level of emotional intensity. And we saw some change, we saw some surprising findings, and we saw some non-surprising findings. So it'll be interesting to see what you think. So first of all, in terms of the big picture, participants voiced a very strong thread that Native people were treated wrongly, and I think that was more intense. There's definitely more awareness of that, and real awareness among some allies like African Americans and Asian Pacific Islanders, who, as Crystal mentioned in the previous part, weren't that great in allies originally, but definitely seeing more common ground and more common solutions and parallel solutions. Everyone felt it was critical to acknowledge that truth, and people really wanted their children to learn the truth. What's interesting is people were interested themselves, but they were adamant that the next generation, the children, should learn the truth. And they thought that future generations needed to have accurate information about Native peoples in the past and the present. There was some surprise at the present situation, and there was also a tremendous amount of variance. Not everybody was monolithic, and even in certain groups like Latinos, there was a tremendous amount of variation by where you came from and what your experience was. People thought that education and social media were the two major ways to break through. They thought there definitely wasn't enough information out there. They commented a lot on the invisibility of contemporary Native American stories, and that was part of the wrongdoing. And they volunteered that invisibility leads to a lot of negative stereotyping. And people were rich, and we'll show you this in a moment, in terms of positive stereotypes, but they also thought there was a lot of misinformation and disinformation about Native Americans. I've got so many things I'm balancing here. Sorry. In terms of the groups, the range was enormous. When I think about what I've heard here and learned so much from you all in terms of Native American 101, the audience that you're facing, you must feel jerked around because just so much difference from the white women near casinos who were some of the most negative, and to people in New Mexico who were just absolutely flabbergasted that you didn't have that in school, and most people are going, no, and we had that from day one in school. So tremendous amount of variation. African American men and women and Asian American Pacific Islanders were the most promising allies, in part because they really saw not just familiarity in the condition and the power struggles and the different kinds of struggles that produce the conditions, but commonality in the current structures that reinforce things and the solutions. Like Asian Americans saw a lot of similarity between what they're looking for and land-back programs. African Americans, and it's interesting how much George Floyd has come up here, saw a lot of similarity in terms of violence and disruption and stereotyping and struggles. White people who lived near a tribal community and white non-college educated people were tougher. And unfortunately, as Crystal said, those white older guys are pretty tough. They're married to some pretty tough women too, so it's not like those white non-college women are any dream to be next to in some cases. And you may know that from firsthand. People think, and it was really interesting because it looks like the Nielsen data had a little bit of this tension. People think they hear. One big difference in the 7 and 8 years is people think they hear about Native Americans now. Yeah, we hear a range of information. People didn't always say they had heard a lot, but they think, oh yeah, we hear information. But they were very, very surprised at a number of facts. And one of the things that was really interesting, and this is one of the things that focus groups can give you, when we provided a whole series of facts, and I'm just going to give you 3 of the top testing ones that really change people's attitudes. We always look for whether people are skeptical. Like, you know, now we live in an era of facts and alternative facts, so there's a lot of people that question facts. What was really interesting is even though people tried to get their heads around it and try to understand some of these facts, they were not very skeptical. And some of these facts were actually really game-changing. So one of the people mentioned in terms of things that they hear, missing Native American women, although what's really interesting later on, you'll see they actually have a tremendous amount more information about missing white women than missing Native American women. Concerns about how Native Americans are portrayed in history, poverty on reservations, reparations, hunting, disputes, casinos, and so on. In general, we asked people the ratio of positive to negative that they heard, and most people said it's about 50-50, which is better, I think, than it was 7 or 8 years ago, when it would have tilted more negative. Latinos said, they were the one group that said that they generally hear positive things. But the Latino community, which was more of an ally 7 and 8 years ago, is very, very complicated, and it'll be interesting to discuss that with you all in Q&A. The facts that were game-changing for people was that Native Americans were one of the fastest-growing groups in the country. People were just flabbergasted at that. People thought that Native Americans they didn't think they had disappeared completely like they did 8 years ago, but they thought, oh, no, the population's declining. They must be declining under all kinds of social pressures. Tribal nations are the 8th largest employer in the country. This was game-changing too. And it really opened up, particularly among some audiences like Latinos, about allyship in economic development. If this community is already this big an employer, this kind of energy in the economy, we ought to go, go, go together. Because Latinos perceive themselves to be very energetic, very big contributors to the economy as well. And Native people being required to pay federal taxes. This was really interesting because, as Crystal related to you, the last time we did this research was done, there was a lot of stereotyping that Native Americans get all this stuff for free. Now, that was still fairly present, not as dominant as it had been, because in some ways people think, well, nobody's getting anything for free anymore. But the fact that Native Americans paid federal taxes was eye-opening and created a bond. There's nothing, as one person said, that's more all-American than paying federal taxes. Some of the people that were the most prejudiced and the most stereotypic said, well, I don't believe they pay the same amount of federal taxes as us. But those were the 3 kind of game-changing statistics. We asked people, what do you associate with Native American and Indigenous? And by the way, focus groups are a great way to find language. So everybody thought they understood what a Native American was. Some people were confused about Indigenous. Some people very familiar with it, thought they were equivalent. Some people not sure what the word Indigenous meant. But in terms of the strength of Native cultures, people said it's a thriving culture. This was radically different than 7 or 8 years ago. It was a tight-knit community. There's resilience. People think Native Americans are strong and resilient and persistent. Prioritization of family, which people said in a very admiring way. Traditions and spirituality of Native peoples. Although sometimes people thought that you're almost making them mystics rather than spirituality. But the spirituality, very positive and very powerful to people. Now for the other side of the equation. Of course, these are word clouds that show you how the bigger the word, the more, just as you've been seeing in your own votes, the more the mention of that word. The dominant negative stereotypes, pretty similar to what we saw before. Alcohol, drug abuse, and misuse, poverty, gambling addiction, lack of education. Casinos were both a positive and a negative, by the way. When people said, where do they get these stereotypes? People were much more analytic than they had been 7 or 8 years ago. I think this is a very, very powerful and interesting time to engage in a conversation with people because they are trying to think through how they get these stereotypes, which are true, which aren't true, how do you deal with them. So they say the dominant places they get stereotypes are media, movies, and TV shows. But people also agreed that often stereotypes are passed down to children from parents, and that people will early on in life acquire a very persistent attitude, a very strong attitude, and they will keep it their whole lives. People thought that the way to break down stereotypes was person to person, education, more roles in the media, and they also thought that everyone had a responsibility, and allies felt that everyone needs to make a commitment. And one of the things that was really interesting is whites and Latinos tended to think everyone has a responsibility. African Americans and Asian Pacific Islanders said, no, everyone has a responsibility, but we have a collective and structural responsibility too, and we have to make a commitment to do something about this. In terms of, people said, oh yeah, I know prominent Native figures, and then they couldn't name anybody. And they were kind of surprised at themselves. It's like, wait a minute. who is that person? Why am I blanking on it? And then when we showed people images, and you can see some of the images that we showed, people were rarely familiar with anybody. They could rarely recognize them. Now this is really a deficit, because usually people can recognize people. They often don't remember the name, like half of people don't know who their member of Congress is, but they recognize the face. In this case, even when we showed the images, people were unable, even though they had started out saying, oh yeah, I know Native Americans, they were unable to recognize the face. People thought that was bad. That was almost in and of itself an awakening process. And people thought that Native Americans needed increased representation. And I've noticed in your answers that word representation has been very strong in your answers. Well, guess what? It's very strong in the public too. They see representation as a key solution. And they believe there needs to be representation in government and media, and they believe it's extremely important. Participants were most familiar with Zane and Deb Haaland, but even they registered just barely familiarity. They didn't have negative images of the people that they knew, that's a good thing. Often people remember people for the negative, and we know that psychologically we know that people remember negatives more than they remember positives. They didn't have any negative recall, but they didn't have any recall at all. And again, people thought overwhelmingly the solution here is we need more representation. People were very eager to have Native American representation in government. We should really think about moving that up in our agenda, because people thought, we need new leadership. We got to find somebody younger than 81, and Native Americans would be really good to include in that process. Mascots. Wow, what a heated, complicated topic. People were very aware of the mascot issue, but they were also much more conflicted than the survey data might have indicated. And they were, particularly older and whites, were very conflicted and compromised about changing local mascots. People also said, while they understood the national mascot controversy, and they thought, well, the local mascot, that's a compliment. We don't want to change that because that's a compliment. We're admiring that. And there was a lot of degree to which there are bigger currents going on right now, right, in terms of demographic change that are very threatening, particularly to blue-collar men. And this mascot changing tapped into some of that, particularly when it was local mascots. It tapped into a sense of threat and loss of place. Younger people, very adamant that you don't call someone something that you don't use someone's name if they don't want it used, independent of whether you think it's a compliment or not. And they ultimately, whether they thought it was a problem or not, very, very deferential to the decision being made by local Native American communities. Now, they emphasized local, and some people thought, well, this may be a national issue, a national fight, a national division, but I think our local community is just fine. So local voice is very important. They were also, particularly women, really shook up by the idea that this whole debate of mascots can cause psychological harm. And Gen Z and the white suburban women really brought on by that argument. They thought, I never thought of that. It makes perfect sense. This is something that really upsets me. This makes me want to move more aggressively on changing this. Some people in every group had heard of the boarding school news, and thank you, Washington Post. That was if you haven't seen that, that was a spectacular story. And I have to tell you, I live in Washington, and I come from Montana, and obviously we had boarding schools there and in Canada right above us. I never thought I'd see the front page of the Washington Post have a story that was that honest and that thorough. It was an amazing experience. People thought that the boarding schools were negative. They thought they engaged in abusive practices, but they were stunned when they heard the level of harm that was done, the number of people that were abused, the number of people that had been 100,000 removed, and that language removed was very powerful to them. And they were really, honestly, sincerely horrified and disgusted. They were absolutely flabbergasted that it continued to 1969. People thought, oh, you know, they wanted to put this in, and in general, they want to put the harms in ancient history or old history. And remember, Americans don't like historical conversations very much. In another study, we once asked people, do you think we should take into consideration history when we make decisions? And people said, oh, yeah, we definitely should do that. And we said, well, how long a history do you think we should take into consideration? People said, oh, 6 months to a year. So people not good at history and not good at math. People think that there are schools in their areas. Some of the Westerners in particular thought there were shuttered schools in their area, so they thought it was pretty recent. But even the people that were most familiar were absolutely flabbergasted at the idea of 1969. Missing and murdered Native women. Across the groups, people were familiar with the concept. And they thought of themselves, it's really interesting. You're almost in a situation now where people think of themselves as so improved that they don't realize how shallow their improvement is, to refer to some of the things that Charlene has said. So people thought, yeah, I'm very familiar with the missing and murdered Native American women. But then when we dug deeper and we showed the Gabby Petito story and the Savannah LaFontaine Greywind story, nobody knew the Greywind story. Everybody knew the Gabby Petito story. So then they were shocked at themselves. They acknowledged that there must be real media bias in the prioritizing of these stories. And African Americans said, well, this is just like our community. You know, there are a lot of missing African Americans too. And so many things reinforced for African Americans. They are really, this is a sea change, they are really gun-ho allies here and want to move together. And they said, this is so similar to our own experience. Participants thought this is something that can be changed. Some things they were wondering, how do you change it? How do you change it in the long run? How do you change the stories we tell? It's going to take time. This is something they thought, this can be changed immediately. These stories should be in the media. It should be drawn to people's attention. And there is real bias in the media. And we should, in the media industry, there needs to be more diversity and representation in media. And there needs to, and the interesting thing about the missing women story, when we asked people to solve that problem, they then went into a broader set of problems. So it was very interesting to see people move from a set of narrower solutions where they thought we can really fix this right now to a set of broader solutions, including things like reparations, fines, et cetera, money from the government, that broader solutions. One of the things that was very, very prominent in people's minds was the connection of Native Americans to climate, natural places, and wildlife. People really, really made that connection. They have a great deal of respect for Native American leadership, Native American action and courage, Native American spokespeople, Native American as watchdogs and warners to everybody else of what is going on. They think Native Americans value land and the earth more than other groups. They think sustainability is a cultural norm. This was something new, not just valuing, but sustainability. And you have a very, very powerful voice in the sustainability conversation. People thought that Native Americans were very powerful and real truth tellers in telling people what corporate America was doing. And so they thought you blew the whistle on corporate America, and particularly when corporate America is destroying the earth, and that you are frontline protectors, frontline activists, and frontline watchdogs and warners. They were really, really interested in the opinion. We also tested that 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity was in indigenous territories, and people were really shocked at that. Now, people are not very good at math, okay? Americans are notoriously bad at math, but they know that 80% is a big damn number. And so that also gave kind of extra credibility an extra representation because they thought, wow, they already have this orientation, but if they are over 80% of our biodiversity, then they really ought to be frontline players. They really ought to be having a say, and we ought to know what the opinion is much more. We addressed visibility and tribal sovereignty, and people gave titular say to sovereignty. They thought, okay, well, tribes should be able to decide a lot of things like who's in the tribe, youth education, what's their land base. They thought that tribal sovereignty. But they were also very unclear about what happens when tribal sovereignty interacts with federal sovereignty. They were very confused about what that interaction would look like and what would come out of that. They responded to the land acknowledgement, but a number of people, particularly allies, felt the solution does not go far enough. And African Americans said, is this respect or is this lip service? So people are very aware of it. Some people, particularly whites and Gen Zers, were celebrating it, but some people like African Americans and AAPI were saying, this isn't going nearly far enough. The land back, and I don't need to tell you this, I've had several table conversations. This was confusing to people, and a lot of people said, I just don't know what that means. I don't know how that would be operationalized. Are we moving a whole city? Are you taking land that my house is on? People really, really confused. We read a rather complicated, honestly detailed explanation of land back, and people were pretty hungry for understanding what land back meant. One audience, by the way, two audiences for land back, African Americans and Asian Pacific Islanders. They were really positive about land back and much more discerning that, of course, we're not talking about giving the entire state of Montana over and kicking out all the white people, which some of the white people thought maybe we were. We then tested, and I love this part, whoops, and you aren't going to get to see it. Huh, it's stuck. Maybe we can have someone come and unstick it, or maybe that shows I'm a little over time, so maybe they're just implementing that. But so I'll read you the three statements. We read three statements to people, and all of them helped improve images, and then people wrote their own statements. So statement number one was, much of what it means to be and live as Americans, we owe to Native American people, from our food to our language to our sports to our love of the land, even our system of government. People did not know that, but they really liked that statement. Some groups, there we go, thank you. Some groups, like African Americans, thought, well, you owe it to other people too, not just Native Americans. And in general, there were some groups that were sensitive to when we sounded like we were excluding other groups. But in general, this statement was very, very popular. The second statement was very popular as well. Many tribes are thriving, growing in numbers, holding on to their culture, and building businesses in parts of the country that need economic development. Latinos love this statement. They loved all three, but they loved this statement because they really wanted to be united together in economic development. And people also, right now we're finding that people are much more interested in asset messaging rather than deficit messaging. And a lot of the Native American narrative to non-Native Americans seems like deficit. So as we often say in our presentations, Martin Luther King didn't start his speech with, I have a problem for you. People have a lot of problems. They want to see something that they can feel better about, that they can make progress on. And so these statements that were positive and asset-oriented were very, very positive. The third statement, Native peoples live the values the world needs, shared responsibility, interdependence, respect for the earth, equality, respect for elders, having a say, measuring our actions, and their effects on generations to come. This was really a showstopper for people. They needed longer to think about this one. And a lot of people really liked it because there is a lot of desire to learn about Native American culture, a lot of improvement in awareness and desire, behavior seeking out to know more about Native American culture. Some groups felt like, well, it's not just Native Americans who have the values that we need. Other groups have the values that we need too. So some people found it a bit of an overstatement, a bit exclusionary, but in general, this was a really different idea to people. And then finally, people were told to write their own statements. And what they wrote were change. People associate, it's really interesting, 8 years ago, people associated Native Americans with things that were static and historic and maybe even gone. Now, at the end of the group, not necessarily in the beginning, they associate, wow, Native Americans can be part of change. We want change. This can be a dynamic place we can join together for change. They talked about compassion. They talked about all of us needing to own that Native Americans have been wrongly treated, and they talked about the contributions of Native peoples. Very, very interesting that they just didn't stop at what was wrong. They extended it to the contributions as well. And in general, people concluded, I want to learn more about Native peoples. I am really hungry to make advances, and I want to be sure that my kids and the next generation get it right and get that knowledge. And Gen Zers, by the way, last point I will make, Gen Zers are the most interested in their siblings of any cohort we've ever had. And they were very, very interested in making sure that the next generation, their younger brothers and sisters, were getting this education as well as themselves. So very rich findings, I think. You'll see lots to dig into more. We don't plan to have the last word here, but I think a lot of really provocative thinking and opportunities. So thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Well, we have a few minutes for questions. Let me just start with this. With this remarkable range of groups, what's kind of a strategy to take that information and make it affect change?
Boy, isn't that hard. So one strategy, I love the woman from the College Education Fund. One strategy is to get that $4 billion. That's a key strategy. But I think there are a couple of strategies. One is to think about this as concentric circles. And that one of the things, because people want to have so much one-on-one conversation about this, to think about engaging allies and giving allies more information, and then the allies engaging their friends and families. So I think that there is a lot of possibility of engaging in concentric rings. And there are two groups of allies, African Americans and Asian Pacific Islanders. Asian American Pacific Islanders are really ready to go. And then Gen Zers right behind them. A second strategy is to look for, and I thought Charlene was really eloquent on this in Crystal, look for what culture moves things faster than politics, than policy, than acronyms, and thinking about ways culture is just lagging behind so much. And people are really ready to be quite critical of media, social media, and our culture in general. And they want to demand representation. So they want to celebrate it and they want to demand it. And so thinking of ways, and I thought Charlene had some really interesting strategies of making cultural institutions aware this is to their economic benefit to be telling these stories, to be getting this out, to be countering these stereotypes, is a way to have an echo chamber. But in general, I think it's to know that people are ready, to provide something positive as well as negative, and to realize that we need to think about this in concentric circles that engage our allies to also take this message out.
Well, let me pick up on that. One of the areas that seems to be so contradictory is that on one hand, people who live near casinos are fearing casinos. On the other hand, they're likely employed or someone they know.
Yeah, they're not our allies. People have some really mean neighbors, okay? I don't want to be, I wouldn't want to be Mrs. Alito's neighbor in Washington, and there's some people you don't want to meet who are living, so my people who are living near casinos you don't want to meet. Yeah, it is contradictory, and it wasn't necessarily exposure, because sometimes exposure worked as an advantage, and sometimes, like New Mexico, or where they have a story that they tell themselves about themselves, and they really seem to have sincerely more knowledge, and then living near casinos, where you'd think it would be much more positive, a lot of tensions. I think there's an overlay of proximity and familiarity with threat. And there are some groups that are very threatened out there right now, not so much by, not just by Native Americans, but by life in general and by the racial change in America in general.
You mentioned a shift in the Latino discourse. Maybe elaborate on that.
Yeah, I'm really, and Michael had some really interesting thoughts about this, so I hope you engage in this conversation. It was confusing. And I don't know that we completely know it. I think there are a couple of things. One, Latinos, and we all know this, they're far from monolithic. So trying to get underneath that. Latinos were there at hello, but then when it went to action, the African Americans and the Asian Pacific Islanders were ready to move a lot faster. Also, it seems like when we looked at the data, Latinos feel their own pressure. They also feel they feel these issues are complicated because of their own relationship to indigenous people. And then they also felt like we have to make it on our own. You have to take, let's all take personal responsibility for this and we'll get it done. They were pulling back on the kinds of structural change that African Americans, Gen Zers, and Asian American Pacific Islanders were eager to have.
One of the words that I didn't see on the word cloud, maybe I just missed it, was colonial.
Oh, no, it
And
didn't
I'm
come
curious
up.
if
Yeah.
that came up at all, or if there's
No.
a disconnect between
No,
the large...
not at all. Not at all. That's a really good point. Yeah, not at all. I don't think there was one mention of it.
Wow. What other changes do you see that should be acted on immediately?
Well, the hunger that people have for information, the degree to which they know that Native Americans are alive now, and so they're really eager to be working with them to see them represented. The number of, the desire to have representation in media, in culture, and in government. We really, I think that a lot of organizations or parties or even cabinets think, oh, well, we've got one Native American, good for us. We did a bang-up job here. And actually, real people, and we did a courageous thing, it's actually no. People would be ready to see several Native Americans in the cabinet, and in other forums as well. And then I think some of these, to get the economic argument out and to join in economic development, and then to get, to obviously utilize the strength of your environmental voice. In some ways, I know that the environmental voice can seem like a franchise rather than an opportunity, but it's really strong. It's really strong. And then I think there's just too much to do, honestly. And I think setting priorities is probably part of the issue. But there are a myriad of things that could be done.
Celinda Lake, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Was there a question? Oh, there is a question.
Ah, sorry.
I thought it was telling me we were out of time, that's why.
Thank you. Ani
thought the same
Buju,
thing.
Indigenous Mikinikwe. Good afternoon. My native name is Turtle Woman. I have the responsibility to speak the truth for all the people. My Anglo name is Stacy Boland. I'm the CEO of the National Indian Health Board. I have three things that I have that were triggered by this
Thank you.
this presentation. Number one, I think the most powerful American Indian in the country right now is not represented here at all, and that is Tom Cole. He is the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee. That's the first Indian in the history of this country that is the chairman of the whole Appropriations Committee, who, according to the US Constitution, is where all authority to spend federal dollars comes from. I
Wow.
think we ought to put his picture up there,
Yeah.
okay?
Really
Chickasaw,
good.
and he's a huge friend to Indian country. He's done tremendous things for Indian country.
Thank you.
The second thing is I have no problem with taking Montana back. I'd go right now. And I have an idea, because I have a dream, I have a vision. Two things. Number one, why don't we have a policy in the United States, since all of the wealth in this country is based on the land, the water, the trees, the minerals. Why don't we have 1% of every real estate transaction in this country go into an American Indian fund as rent for our property?
Wow.
That would be trillions of dollars in a matter of years.
Wow.
Number three, I think the number one issue that we have to deal with when we're talking about culture is a recognition that our languages were so powerful that the United States government had an over 100-year policy of boarding schools, and the number one thing they tried to eradicate were our languages. Because language is culture. It tells me who I am, where I'm from, and who I connect to. If you take the sinew of that away, you take away all my connectivity to my relatives, all the 7 generations ahead of me, and all of them that are behind me, and you leave me alone in the world to be connected to nothing. So we need our languages back, and the United States of America should have a reverse boarding school policy that for the next 100 years they will invest in revitalizing our languages, teaching our languages to white people and everybody else, getting our culture back, getting our religions back, our ceremonies and our medicines, and then we will be fully healthy, we will be empowered, and that will be a culture change that we can all benefit from.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Absolutely.
Thanks so much for that presentation and for those words. My name is Trevor Smith, co-founder of the Bliss Collective. Bliss stands for Liberation Indigenous Sovereignty. Started it with my colleague Savannah Romero, who used to work at Illuminative. So my questions are, were there any tensions, because we're interviewing activists right now on the top, black activists and indigenous activists on the topic of reparations and land back. Were there any tensions with black people as it related to land, is the first question. The second question is, do black people associate the term reparations with indigenous communities? I think being an organizer in the reparations space for the past couple of years, you know, when we talk about reparations, it is mostly for, in relation to our people, to black people. So wondering in the focus groups if the term reparations, when you were talking to black people, if they associated it with indigenous communities.
Yeah, really good point. Yes, they did raise it, and I will share with you, we are in the midst of a project on African American liberation and reparations. And what's been really interesting in all of the African American groups, without exception, this project is on African American reparations. They will bring up and volunteer, and we need Native American reparations too. So there is a real overlap there. In terms of land, it was interesting. The Asian American Pacific Islanders understood the land back more, and I think that's because of the Japanese reparations and things like that, Japanese American reparations. The African Americans who raised reparations were not as responsive to land. They weren't pushing back on it and land acknowledgement, et cetera, and they thought, you know, that's something in our community as well. But they were pushing back on it because they thought there was some confusion about what it meant. There was a thought, how would it be implemented? And then there was the thought, we have land issues too, and we'll never get that land back either. And I can't imagine, I just can't see a world where that happens. So they weren't as positive on land back as Asian American Pacific Islanders were, who really were the most gung-ho, because they thought, I can't see it, and we've got it too, and I can't see it. And then the reparations overlap very big.
Hi, I'm Shirley Snavy. I'm a Ponca tribal member in Nebraska. I also work with Mark Trahant on
That's
the
great.
ICT newscast. So what do you think were the most harmful stereotypes that these people had about Native Americans? And then also, did you guys talk about elections at all? Did they see any evidence that we sway elections in these states?
Oh, no, not elections. They wanted people to they wanted more people to run for office. And they definitely thought there should be more representation. We didn't get into that, and I think it would be very interesting. We were talking at our table about that. I would have loved to, in retrospect, I would love to have tested that. And Mark and I were talking about it because Mark's wife works on Native Vote, Get Out the Vote. And I'm from Montana, where Western Native vote is very, very strong, as you know. In terms of the, what was your first question again? I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, harmful stereotypes. Well, I'm humbled to answer that question because I really think it's for you all to tell me what are the most harmful stereotypes. But I would say some of the ones that were very concerning, first of all, just there's stereotypes, there's misinformation, and then there's deliberate disinformation. And folks at my table have been really articulate, and I'm taking this away as a learning about intentionality and your comments about language and intentionality. But so there's things in each bucket. But in terms, it was game-changing for people to know that the population was increasing, not decreasing. It was game-changing for people to know the economic clout of Native Americans. So that those are not necessarily stereotypes, but they're misinformation that when overturned are really cause people to think. The most negative stereotypes, I think, alcohol misuse and abuse. I don't know. I mean, again, I feel intimidated about answering that question because I think you all should tell me what you think. I'd be really interested, not to put you on the spot, but I'd be really interested to know what you think are the worst stereotypes that you saw in that data.
I have to say that in the tax situation.
Yeah.
That's really a huge one that I just can't believe that still exists. Oh, I said taxes and being drunk.
Yeah, really good point. Really good point.
Thank you. Lael Echohawk. I'm an attorney, member of the Pawnee Nation, and descendant of the Upper Athabascan people, and Crystal's cousin. So proud of her. Shout out, Crystal. I have a question. My sister and I, all my siblings were born and raised in Alaska, and I know that I've spoken with some other folks from Alaska here, wondering why Alaska wasn't included in the focus group. We see today in sort of mainstream, I guess, media, most of the portrayal that I see, at least, of Native Americans is in Alaska, right? We've got the terrible one, Alaska State Troopers. You know, we've got The Last Frontier. You have all these. You have Molly Denali. And in Alaska, that, you know, we were talking earlier, the people there, people groups there are very diverse. I mean, Mark was up there for how many years? So curious why Alaska wasn't included. I mean, we talk about Tom Cole. I think one of the next most powerful people in Congress as it pertains to American Indian Alaska Native issues is Lisa Murkowski, and the only reason she has her seat today is because of Alaska Native vote.
Right.
And so just curious about that. Thank you.
Yeah, and I don't know if there's the folks from Illuminative who want to answer that. We do a lot of work in Alaska, and we're Mary Potola's pollster. And definitely agree with you in terms of the imagery, the importance, the knowledge in the community. It just seems like a different environment. People are more aware broadly. The structures are different. And it just seemed like, you know, you've got the subsistence issue and things like that. Although people acknowledge hunting issues down in the lower 48 too. But mainly the thought was, since we were recruiting in each group across states, that was just a very unique environment. We didn't include indigenous folks from Hawaii either, because again, thought that's different population. So and you know, when you get that $4 billion, give us a little bit for research. But we just finished focus groups actually in Anchorage with urban Alaska Natives for Mary Potola. So we have a really keen interest in it, but it was just thought to be different enough that and you know, having one person in a group or something wouldn't allow us that rich a conversation. But should be looked at, definitely should be looked at.
Actually, one of the great examples of that is next week is the anniversary of the Indian Reorganization Act, which didn't apply in Alaska for 2 more years after it was passed.
Oh, wow.
I heard there was a provocative question from a member of the Pawnee Nation about Alaska. my relatives. No, great question. I was literally back in the green room. I'm like, I gotta run down the hall. You're absolutely right. It came down to money. This stuff is not cheap, right? And I think like as we kind of looked at, we did not have the $3+ million that we did for R&T. We did this on about $500,000. So we really had, you know, thank God we had great partners that worked with us and really thought about how we were going to do it. And so predominantly, the reason the states we did choose had to deal with like, hey, if this is an election year, right, and we're looking at what are the key states, right, that we're looking around natives vote and other kinds of things, and based on our budget, like, can we go here? But it is a really important question that we do. Everything I could hear you saying about Alaska, yes, 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 right? And also thinking about our relatives in Hawaii. So it's just like more of these things, like we need to get more investment so that we're really getting a full picture of everything that's happening with our relatives and the way that people are looking at our people all across this country. So thank you for the question.
Thank you, Crystal.
Any more? There's one over here.
Hello, thank you. My name is Yaj Pending. I'm from the Dene Nation, also Hickory Apache. I just wanted to comment and say that I'm not sure if it's been mentioned yet. It is the 100th anniversary of Native Americans being able to vote in this country. So I'd like to urge everybody here to use your connections and your energy from this convening to put pressure on everybody we know for the future of elections, for the future of our people, and to pressure everybody to do their research, because I should have known earlier that it is the 100th anniversary of that,
Wow.
and I don't think many people know it all. So yeah, thank you so much for talking today.
Thank you. Really important point.
Anin Buju Bagnigijgo Indigenous Cause. My name is Holly Cook Macaro. I'm the chair of the board here at Illuminative, also a political contributor at Indian Country Today with Mark and Shirley. And I was really interested to hear and Mark, you noted this, the kind of movement away with the Hispanic community. You also mentioned there was an affinity with the Asian American Pacific Islander community. I didn't know if you meant Pacific Islander of that.
Oh, you know, good point. Asian American. I mean, we did have, yeah, we only had Asian American. Thank you. Good correction.
Because it was about land.
Yeah.
And I do a lot of work, obviously, on the political side. And the Asian American Caucus, the Hispanic Caucus, and Congress are two of the biggest allies on Indian country's issues.
Interesting.
And so I'm really curious if you, and I know that's your main focus area is the political polling, if you see, you know, how that's going to impact, and I'll be talking a little bit about this tomorrow. I see several points that you're talking about that kind of jive with what the conversations I had as well, but I know that it's a really important base of support. When we have an issue, we can't carry it alone with the Native American Caucus. The first place we go knocking is the head of the CBC, the AAPI, you know, all of those. And so where those sentiments lie and whether that's going to carry over into their representation in Congress would have an impact on Indian country.
Oh, really good point. And, you know, we haven't even talked about this, and I don't know what's appropriate or not, but like you, I work a lot with those caucuses and the CBC, and I think that it would be a really good idea to brief the caucuses on what we found in their populations. That's a really good point. I think they would be very hungry for it. I think the CBC and the Asian American Caucus, and we work a lot with the Asian American Caucus and CBC, I think they'd both be surprised at the data. And then I think the Hispanic Caucus would be good co-problem solvers. And by the way, you know, you'd much rather go talk to someone Latino than a white woman next to a casino, okay? So maybe I didn't need to say that. It's obvious. It just was noticeable because they were so gung-ho and allied in the beginning, 7 and 8 years ago, and then they were holding back, and they weren't the same as African Americans and Asian Americans. So it was just, I don't want to suggest they were bad, they were more muted than we had expected them to be, is how I would put it. But great points.
Hello, I'm Abigail Echo Hawk, another one. Sister to Lael, cousin to Crystal. Citizen of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma and descendant of the Upper Otton-Athabascan people of Mentasta Lake, Alaska. And I do a lot of work in missing and murdered indigenous peoples, really focused on women. And so one of the things that was interesting to me and not surprising was the difference between Gabby Petito and Savannah Graywind. And it brings forward, and I'm interested to hear if any of the focus group participants responded to, or there was discussion regarding to the risk and risk that is taken. So for example, when Gabby Petito was missing in Wyoming, I had just contributed to a report that found more than 700 missing and murdered Native people in the state of Wyoming. We didn't even get any coverage, and 2 weeks later, the one missing white woman in Wyoming, hit national news. So I was on PBS NewsHour, where I discussed the difference in the coverage on PBS NewsHour, and within 30 minutes of that airing, I was hit with my first death threat of that particular instance. It's part of my job, that threat. And it is, many of us take substantial risk. And so I was curious, was there any conversations in here in regards to the risk or allyship or opportunities of support across the different demographics that were part of this in alleviating, supporting, or really assisting us in mediating that level of risk?
That is a superb question, a superb idea for the next set of focus groups. We did not get into that, and the way that we structured the conversation wouldn't have particularly led it into that. Even if people had those ideas, they would have, we were talking more about representation, visibility, power, positive views, negative views, but it's a spectacular idea for future research. We didn't really get into it. And by the way, I have worked for 3 Echo Hawks. They have been the most superb people I've ever worked for. I haven't worked for you two, so I can't wait. And in my view, there cannot be enough Echo Hawks in the room.
We have a virtual question.
Yes, last question, we're just going to chime in from our virtual audience. How can we navigate difficult decisions where people are not open to learning about Native issues?
Well, I will give Mark and Crystal the last word on that, but I think there are 2 things. First of all, one of the things that I think to take away from this is the audience that is open is so big. This is a moment. This is truly a moment. And granted, people always think that they are better than they really are, but people want to be better here. They're big audiences. Secondly, you're engaged in demographic changes that are going to make your job easier every single day. The older people are passing on. I once said in an op-ed, died, and AARP said, I don't know why you use that word, died, like that's news. But anyway, they're passing on. Younger Gen Zers are coming in really fast. And of course, the racial change is so great that we may be so-called majority minority in 16 years. So the first thing I would say is concentrate on all of the people that are open to this, because there are so many. But in some communities and in some areas, we have to look at how to break open. And there were some openings. There's definitely an opening about taking on corporate power that is damaging communities. There was an opening around economic development that brought in some people who were not accessible otherwise. There was definitely a desire to have the next generation. Now, we want to hurry history here, but the next generation to learn things. So I think first of all, there's a huge pool. I mean, the biggest difference that I felt and I wasn't in the first round of research, but reading the first round and reading this round is how much greater the opening is. And I'm not saying it's easy, but there's a great opening. There's a lot of people really eager for this conversation, eager to move, eager to learn, eager to have their kids taught the truth, eager to learn themselves accurate history. And then the second thing I would say is that group is going to get bigger every year. And the third thing I would say is those allies may be good contact with some of the people who don't want to hear us. And there are some openings for those people who don't want to hear us, particularly around economy and some of the economic questions. And I don't know, Mark or Crystal, I mean, you have been the long-term observers about talking to people that don't support you. Additions?
I'm a journalist, I just tell stories.
Okay, fair enough. But others should contribute. That should be a table conversation. But we got lots of people to talk to. We're not short of people to talk to. That's the good news out of this research.
Well, we'd like to thank you for participating in this panel, and thank you to Celinda. And she'll be around, so feel free to grab her. Thank you.